Hi everyone, Will Waller here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO of the National Wheelchair Basketball Association, and I'm here today with author David Davis, the author of Wheels of Courage. Wheels of Courage are about how paralyzed veterans from World War II invented wheelchair sports, fought for disability rights, and inspired a nation. David, if you don't mind, can you give the audience an overview on your background, other books that you've published?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, and just want to say hi to your audience. Yeah, I'm a journalist and author. I live in Los Angeles. Have lived here since 1986. Um, Worked at a newspaper, the LA Weekly, for many years, and then have been writing books since about 2000. I have a really keen interest in the Olympics. I've written my two previous sort of narrative books. One was about the 1908 Olympic Marathon in London, the London Olympics, and the second was a biography of Duke Kahanamoku, the great Olympic swimmer, Hawaiian, godfather of surfing. And actually, it was doing research on Duke Kahanamoku that led me to write Wheels of Courage.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And it's funny how these tentacles can get created, with a strong Olympic foundation, and then for this to now segue into the Paralympics, which we'll touch on here a little bit later. I'm so glad that those connections happened to get you to the point of writing this. I was very lucky to learn about your book immediately upon its release. We have a longtime contributor to the sport, Cheryl Vines. Her husband was the president of the NWBA for many years, a coach on the Paralympic level and down in Arkansas with a preeminent successful team. She sent me a copy straight away. It surprised me, and I have to tell you, I couldn't put it down, and I'm constantly recommending it to others, and I really recommend it to everyone who might be watching. So I do want to say that, I'm really thankful for the investment that you made in memorializing the history of the game and various pioneers whose work ultimately changed society. If you think about where we are from a disability rights perspective and the role that wheelchair sports played. And there's very few people who can say that they've had such a transcendent impact, but many of the people in this book did exactly that. So thank you.
That's very kind of you. And I mean, you mentioned the Olympics. I mean, here I am, somebody who I've gone to a dozen Olympics. I've written books about it. I know the history pretty well. And yet I had really no idea about this sort of the origin story of wheelchair sports. I mean, I think it's a bigger deal in England, with Dr. Luke Goodman, who, people know a little bit about. They've made a feature movie about him over there. But I think here in the States, we sort of lost sight of the veterans here who really jump-started, so to speak, wheelchair sports. And again, to me, it was a complete surprise. And that was, I guess, some of the attraction to do the research and write the book, was just to see, how did this happen? Where, and how did I not know about this? And let's get this story out to the world, because it is sort of the one other legacy of sort of the greatest generation.
No doubt, no doubt. And just for us to contextualize all of this, when would you say that your project on Wheels of Courage started in earnest?
Probably 2016. So about 4 years ago. I was fortunate, as I said, when I was doing research on Duke Kahanamoku, I ran into mention of a team called the Rolling Devils, which was a team out of the Naval Hospital in Norco, or Corona, about 50 miles east of Los Angeles. And the name sort of intrigued me. I just thought Rolling Devils, what a great name for any team, and I want to be on that team. But I was fortunate enough. The At the time, the mayor of Norco, a gentleman named Kevin Bash, had done a lot of research, both about the site itself as a hospital during World War II, but also about these Rolling Devils. And he mentioned that one of the players was still alive. And, I was sort of taken aback with wow, that's amazing. And sure enough, Gene Fessenmeyer was still alive. He was about 90, and I was able to connect with him. And then once we started talking, I went down to Texas. He was living in Texas. I went down and met him, and that's when I sort of said to myself, okay, this is a book. And the process of working with my agent and finding a publisher and so on and so forth, and then traveling and doing all the research. That's what 4 years later, here we are. So,
Yeah.
but it was a great journey in that sense.
It's absolutely incredible. I think, it's like any success story. Sometimes people see the outcome and they think, that it was a much simpler or easy project. I can only imagine everything that went into it over that time period. And, it's interesting. We're here today on Veterans Day. And one of the benefits I think that must have come out of this is the in-depth knowledge about World War II and the theaters of the war that you had a chance to learn about, and just the harrowing journey of so many veterans. And I'm just curious if you can share your own perspective on what your new appreciation might be for the veterans of the greatest generation and those since then, as you think about everything that's happened from the stories that you learned about Johnny Winterhaller, Stan Den Edel, and Gene Fessenmeyer, and the many others in the book. What did that do for your perspective and appreciation for veterans? And can you share that with us on this Veterans Day?
Sure. Yeah. Considerable. I mean, I love history, so I certainly have studied and know about World War II on a general level. Certainly, I'm not a military history expert, but I knew about the tides of the war and the basic flow, starting from Pearl Harbor. What I didn't know, and this was a huge surprise for me, you mentioned Johnny Winterhaller, and for your audience that might not know him, before the war, he was an outstanding collegiate athlete at University of Wyoming, baseball, basketball, football. Perhaps could have, maybe made it to a professional level if things had worked out a different way. But he had gone to school as an ROTC, and so he went into the service. And he was stationed in the Philippines in 1941, well before Pearl Harbor. And that was a whole aspect of the war that I didn't realize. The preparation of the US forces under General MacArthur. They were supposed to be training the Philippine Army and getting ready for possible Pacific theater. And again, as someone, I wrote about Duke Kahanamoku, the great Hawaiian swimmer and surfer, so I knew all about Pearl Harbor. I didn't know that basically on the same day, the different timing, the Japanese had bombed the Americans on Philippines and basically destroyed the air power at that time, which really crippled our effort in the beginning years or beginning months in the Pacific theater. So I really had not much knowledge of that. And then just to extend that, Johnny Winterhaller was one of the men captured on Corregidor, and then he was put into various Japanese POW camps in the Philippines. And again, I really had not that much idea or concept of, well, first of all, the hardship and cruelty that was in those POW camps, but also just the extent of that. That was maybe a portion of the war that we really hadn't seen much. I know there was a movie not too long ago, Unbroken, about Louis Zamperini, who was an Olympic, I guess, middle distance runner, and he had been in a POW camp as well. But again, it just hadn't registered like that. And Again, just for your audience, Johnny Winterhaller lost the use of his legs because of malnutrition and lack of medical care in these POW camps. And it was just a very cruel way for this amazing athlete, to meet his fate. And thankfully, he once he came home from the war, he was able to marry his high school and college sweetheart. They eventually adopted 2 kids, and he ended up basically, learning accounting and was the office manager for the doctor who helped save his life, really, in that naval hospital in Norco and Corona. So, but yeah, I had not that much of a knowledge about the Philippine theater and that aspect, and unfortunately, how many men lost their lives and lost their health in those POW camps.
Yeah, the level of detail you had on the journey of Johnny and his experiences, it just shines a light on how open the families must have been to share the specifics, even though I read that Mr. Winterhaller was very private about the details of much of his experience. I felt your book just created such a vivid image of, not only the conflict that existed both in the Pacific as well as in Europe, but the painstaking journey that so many of the veterans went on. Not to mention, we have to say those who made it, because the death toll was just outrageous. And so I want to make sure that on behalf of the NWBA, we're thanking the families for being so supportive of your project and really helping us learn, about those who are the best of us, people like Johnny, Stan, and Gene, and the many others. And we appreciate their contribution to this piece.
Yeah. Well, it's actually it's interesting because obviously Jerry Gene Fessenmeyer was still alive when I was researching and writing, so I was able to interview him and talk to him. But you would be surprised, not just with Johnny Winterhaller, but Stan Denadel and others. They didn't like to talk about the war, and that I think is a common denominator among many of the greatest generation. Maybe some would call it the silent generation. Very stoic, and also very stoic about their injuries. And you sort of mentioned, they were the ones who survived. And I think those veterans, once they came home, once they were able to adjust to this new normal of, okay, we will be paralyzed for the rest of our lives, many of them considered themselves lucky that, hey, we made it back. We are alive. We saw so much death and destruction, and unfortunately, that we're fortunate to be here. And I think that permeated the 2,500 or so paralyzed veterans who were able to survive the war, and many of whom ended up playing some basketball as part of their rehabilitation.
No, agreed. I think what's interesting is that the membership of the NWBA and the thousands of alumni who've participated in the National Wheelchair Basketball Association, they've had to learn to find, a positive from a traumatic situation. And, we learn about our adaptability, our determination from those very difficult circumstances. And it's interesting if you then apply that to the destruction of World War II, the casualties and those who were injured. There was a bright spot that came out of it, and much of that has to do with the disability rights movement and the role that adaptive sports played in changing the perception. So just curious if you could talk about what you learned in your research and what's covered in the book as it relates to those shifts that happen, whether it be healthcare, perspective of disability, and or attitudes towards disability from the prior period to then the post-World War II period.
Yeah, very much a wide chasm in perception, and I appreciate what you were saying about these men and their resilience and what they had to go through. And in a sense, when they did come home, they were sort of medical miracles, and that's because, as you pointed out, so if you were paralyzed, if you were uh, had become, suffered from paraplegia before World War II, um, the medical community basically looked on that as a death sentence. They were called dead enders and no hopers. And from what I've read with World War One, the statistics are something like about 80% or so would be dead within about 18 months, and that was because of sepsis, disease, bed sores that would just permeate, and the doctors had no uh, medicine. They had nothing to combat that. There was no such thing as penicillin then. There was no sulfa drugs at that point, or nothing effective. And those lucky few who sort of managed to survive basically were shunted off to institutions, or they were sort of kept in the family home. And it's sort of an interesting story because, I mean, think about what the wheelchairs looked like back then. They were sort of lazy boy chairs on wheels. There was no mobility. You couldn't just sort of go down the street and go to the office or get in your car. So all those things were working against those with paraplegia. So World War II is literally a game changer. You have the penicillin, and not just the invention of penicillin, but the proliferation in vast amounts so that they could be treated fairly quickly. You had sulfa drugs that the medics, let's say, Gene Fessenmeyer is wounded on Okinawa. You could have a medic come and put some sulfa, and then they transport him to surgical theaters that are right behind the front lines. So you've got pretty quick care for these wounded men. You also had better evacuation at that time. I mean, think about World War One. If you had to come home, you'd put on a ship, and a couple weeks later you're back home. Well, with World War II, you now have some better aviation. So if the men were healthy enough, they could be flown home. It would still take 24 or 36 hours, but at least they'd be home and a lot quicker. And one of the things they started to realize was the sooner that you started to do medical care for people with paraplegia, the better the outcome. Um, and then once they did come home, once they were home, the VA, the Veterans Administration at the time, really concentrated on helping these men. As I mentioned, there were about 2,500. They established, and President Truman, who's then in power, he names Omar Bradley, the general, as the head of the VA system, which had not been doing very well up until then, to be honest. There was a lot of reform that was carried out by Bradley and his staff, including, most importantly for this story, they set up 7 spinal cord injury units in various VA hospitals around the country. And these were very, very well concentrated with doctors who basically presented what they called holistic care. And they had nurses who would turn the patients over every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. They were vigilant about getting these men some exercise and movement, which again was very new. Before, if you were injured, they would put you in a full body plaster cast and just sort of stick you there, which is, of course, we now know the worst thing you could do.
Correct.
And then as it went on, as they recovered, there were efforts both psychologically to help the men adjust to this new normal, which was obviously a very difficult thing to do for young men all of a sudden whose lives have been just changed forever. And also they introduced recreation. And this is, the dot, dot, dot to wheelchair basketball.
I think that's a perfect segue into some of the pioneers, and I'm sure that your research might have shown that that the East Coasters think that the month and day that they started it, and what Luke Goodman was doing in Europe, do they want to stake claim to who was the very first? The reality is there were a variety of pioneers, and one of them who you highlight is someone we talk about when we do an introductory overview of the NWBA. We talk about Ray Neerson and the work that he had done. So maybe you could talk about some of the pioneering work that he did in the field of what we would call therapeutic recreation, and how it sort of started up in Van Nuys, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Bob Ray Neerson, he was the son of a coach. He went to Van Nuys High School, was supposed to be going to UCLA, and then the war happened. But he was a coach's son, and he knew the game very well. He was hired as basically a physical education teacher, therapist at Birmingham General Hospital in Van Nuys, California, in the San Fernando Valley. And that was one of the 7 VA hospitals with the spinal cord injury unit under it at Birmingham, under Ernest Bors, Bors, who is in the field, is super famous in terms of rehabilitation and recreation for the paralyzed veterans. Ray Neerson recognized and saw these men in their wheelchairs and figured out that basketball, which sort of is sort of maybe not your first choice that you would think of, because we value, in basketball we value height, right? We value, Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, speaking here from Los Angeles, sorry, LeBron James. Um, uh, but and it's such a sport about the legs, right? You jump, you run, and you pivot, and all of that. So it's sort of counterintuitive. Why wheelchairs, right? But they
I
figured
have
out.
to
Yeah,
I have to just say that I think what you're describing is still commonplace today, whether it's somebody who sustains a disability or someone who you're trying to convince to come check it out for the first time, who's an able-bodied individual.
right.
Oftentimes people think that, the words wheelchair and basketball don't go together. That was my own personal experience resisting for, months before I would finally try it. And so many people who I know in the game talk about that resistance period because you don't equate wheelchair and basketball as words that would necessarily go together. But please tell us how it sprouted up.
No, agreed. And it's sort of like, I guess, chocolate and peanut butter. You might not think it right off the bat, but by God, it's pretty good. No, but from all accounts, and I will say, I mean, when you talk about doing research as a historian or as an author, uh, thankfully, Bob Ray Neerson kept like every piece of paper. So it really was, and Stan Danadell, who I write about in the book, was on that team in Birmingham, the first team. So we're talking 1946, very casually. They wrote about their remembrances, and to them, it started out casually. The gym was used by able-bodied folks at the hospital, and meanwhile, the men in the wheelchairs are doing physical therapy. They're doing stretches. Maybe they're throwing the medicine ball, and so it was sort of casual. And yet, when you talk about this dichotomy, wheelchair and basketball, when you think about it, it is a good sport for exercising the upper body, the chest, the arms, wrists, which of course are so important, and also core, which are so important for someone who's experiencing paraplegia. So in that sense, it was a good fit. And of course, the space itself, the gymnasium, but also the court, it's smooth, it's flat. It's big, and so you can wheel pretty well, even with those old Everest and Jennings wheelchairs, which weighed about 45 pounds, but which were right state of the art back then. And yet the space was big enough to accommodate 10 wheelchairs, 10 players. And somebody you all well know at NWBA, Armand Thibodeau, he told me that according to veterans that he had encountered over the years, one of the, I guess, controversies early on was what to do about the basket. Should they lower it to accommodate the fact that people are sitting in wheelchairs? And those of you, and I've tried it myself and played it, in the beginning, that's no easy feat, getting the ball up there. And from the free throw line, my gosh, you feel like you're shot putting. But Tip said that the veterans sort of fought to have the basket kept where it was, and I think was an important step for the men, but also for the sport itself. I think if they had lowered it wouldn't be what we see today.
I 100% agree with that point. I think it's such a good one that it would have been seen as less than if the rules would have been modified to make it easier. So the fact that there were adaptations, but the core of the game remained the same, I think helped that perception that was formed eventually, that this was much more than a novelty. There were athletes on the court who were competing, and
Right.
to your point, had they been shooting on a 6-foot rim and potentially dunking, maybe Johnny Winterhaller had long enough arms to do that out of the three, but it certainly would have been different. So
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting about the startup for Ray Neerson and his crew is the fact that there was such a lack of competition, but there was a silver lining in that as well, which is it forced them to find able-bodied competition who were willing to get in the chairs. And that experience of competing in the chairs and interacting with the wheelchair basketball players, I think had an accelerating effect on changing attitudes towards these men with disabilities.
Absolutely. And just to finish the thought on Bob Ray Neerson, he was the first to write up a set of rules. He was very cognizant that sort of the wheelchair is an extension of the body, and many of his sort of core precepts still are, obviously the game has evolved tremendously since 1946, 47, but his core rules, I think it was like 10 or 12 rules that he set up, remain today. And before I address the able-bodied games, just so we can be clear on the East Coast side, so I don't anger anybody. At the same time as, roughly the same time as this is happening in Birmingham in California, it's also happening in Framingham, Massachusetts at Cushing Hospital.
Okay,
And
okay, hold on, time out. I need dates. I need timestamp. I need to know who was first. Was it Ray Neerson or was it the crew out east? Who literally was shooting
right.
first?
I'd say it's a tie, right? I'm not gonna jump into that one. No, I think it was because it was sort of a casual beginnings. But certainly we know that Ray Neerson was the first to set up the rules. The best we can show with newspaper articles, etc., and this is from the in-house Birmingham newspaper. We have a scrimmage that is written up between the Birmingham veterans and their doctors playing in borrowed wheelchairs in December of whatever it was, 46, 47 there. And then a couple weeks later, we see our first account of Cushing playing a game, again, against able-bodied folks. So the first game we think is Birmingham.
There's some strategy that there's some strategy that goes into these scrimmages where you've got the wheelchair athletes who are competing against their able-bodied contemporaries, and it's interesting. At least this is what happens in the current day, you know. So let's say hypothetically, if one of the Los Angeles teams were able to get the Lakers into wheelchairs, they would have the oldest, rustiest, lowest air pressure chairs possible, as if playing someone without a disability in wheelchair basketball isn't already an advantage to those with a disability. We only compound it by giving them the worst equipment ever, just to rub it in a little bit more. I wonder if you know, Reinerson was considering that back then.
You know, I never thought of that. I guess I'm just showing off my naivete, but I think they realized early on that they were going to beat these folks. But you know, by all accounts, the first game between two wheelchair teams was Birmingham against these Rolling Devils out of the Norco, the Johnny Winterhaller team and Jerry Fessenmeyer team. And by all accounts, the doctors at Norco, you know, again, there had been some informal scrimmaging. You know, it was just one of those things. They played volleyball in that we have photographs of veterans playing volleyball in wheelchairs early on. They tried baseball, but you know, that wouldn't be very good with rolling a wheelchair. So they were trying different sports. And you know, we mentioned England and started the Paralympics. Over there, the first sport was archery. That was their first start. And again, it was a chest and arm and, you know, exercise. And then they started playing netball, which is, you know, sort of a cousin of wheelchair basketball, but a different game, quite a different game.
Definitely. And it's really interesting. So between 46 and 48, there were at least a handful of teams across the VA footprint in these spinal units that were basically taking on this approach towards holistic care and beginning to incorporate some of these sports for exercise. And fortunately for us, in Galesburg in 1948, there was some recruiting that took place of a doctoral student named Timothy Nugent. And maybe you can talk a bit about Dr. Nugent. We hold him in the highest regard. We give him, you know, all the credit in the world for bringing more organization to what was a very decentralized model focused just on veterans from the different conflicts. And so maybe some thoughts from you on Dr. Nugent, his influence, and ultimately what it took at that time to achieve some of the things that he did.
You know, Dr. Nugent is on, you know, he's on Mount Rushmore, you know, in terms of wheelchair basketball, no doubt about it. He's sort of the connector between the as you so well put it, this footprint at the VA, this, you know, wheelchair basketball starting really as rehabilitation first, and then sort of recreation and competition second. And then so basically once the men start leaving the hospital, you know, they're now physically able, they have maybe jobs, and this is maybe something we can go into later in terms of when they were lobbying for disability rights. You know, they were able to have cars that were specially adapted for them. They were given stipends to build accessible housing at that time, which was, you know, unprecedented. So as they're leaving the VA, many of the veterans, you know, stop playing wheelchair basketball. They go on with their lives. They get jobs. They start families. That sort of thing. There's a core that keeps going. Many of the Clippers in New England were veterans. Timothy Nugent, starting in Galesburg and then moving on to Champaign-Urbana, he himself was a veteran. He had served in World War II. He's looking at, again, sort of that big picture of having men and women actually in wheelchairs at school. So using maybe the GI Bill or other ways to get into education. And he wants this to be a full experience for the student. So that includes not just being able to go to class, but have a team, a wheelchair basketball team. And he's in the middle of the country. I think he sees a lot. I think he sees a bigger picture than, let's say, Bob Ray Neerson, who's just on the West Coast. And Nugent, without much notice or fanfare, decides to start the first national wheelchair basketball tournament in 1948, and at Galesburg at the time, before he transferred over to Champaign-Urbana. And it was, let's face it, it was a small time affair, basically with Midwest teams. It really wasn't national yet. The East Coast teams weren't able to travel, and the team that came out of Birmingham and became known as the Flying Wheels, the famous Flying Wheels, couldn't make that schedule. But Nugent was, I mean, my gosh, so determined, and very much like Ludwig Goodman, a bit of a self-promoter, one of the hardest working guy there, and determined, frankly, that his vision of wheelchair basketball was going to go beyond just paralyzed veterans. He was going to include people post-polio, as they were called, post-polio patients, because of course, still in the late 40s, early 50s, polio is a big issue here in the United States and elsewhere. So he said, "Hey, you're in a wheelchair with polio? Great, let's go." He accepted amputees as well. So that was he sort of expanded the possibility of wheelchair basketball. That it's not just an island for paralyzed veterans, but it should be for civilians and young men, boys. At that time, he wasn't open to women playing the sport. And certainly there weren't that many women in that situation. But certainly at the time, he's the one who gets the ball rolling to expand that into a national game and a league, a tournament, and then a league. And unprecedented.
What stood out to me in some of your chronicling of Dr. Nugent's impact in particular is the tenacity that was required at the time. So even in a progressive environment like a university, where you would think that there's much more open-mindedness and all of that, the prevailing view on people with disabilities still permeated the university. And there was a ton of reluctance from many places, including Urbana-Champaign. And I think they gave him a flyer and said, okay, we're going to let you do it for a period of time. And in these trailers and wooden shacks and things like that, really found a way to start the program off, and physically toiling on his own to go and build ramps at these buildings, and the semesters would change where the classes were, and they'd move the ramps and put them up, and some creative thinking as well, since the funding wasn't coming from the university, to charge the VA for the therapeutic hours in order to begin to fund the program. And there were just so many instances in the book where you talked about, over the period of time that he was actively involved, the struggles that exist from a financial perspective. And there was an example where he called the Army and got them to agree to use their aircraft to go and pick up the 6 or 8 teams that were going to be competing in the national tournament. And I could just imagine today, like in my role, calling up the Joint Chiefs of Staff and saying, hey, can I get a B-52 bomber or whatever the aircraft is supposed to be called? I need you to go and pick up the Dallas Wheelchair Mavericks and the San Diego Wolfpack and the New York Rolling Knicks and bring them here to Cleveland. I don't know that they're going to return that call.
You don't have them on speed dial, Will? Are you
Not
kidding me?
yet. Not
Yeah.
yet.
Uh, no, that was again, yeah. I mean, I never heard of that, and um, just to let the audience know, I mean, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to look at his archives, Dr. Nugent's archives, which are extensive at the university. And you pointed out, he would get parents to build ramps to school buildings so that the uh, student population could wheel up and go to class. One of the things I found most interesting, he would do sidewalk, do ramps, cutouts, and he just did it. He wasn't necessarily asking for permission, and I think that's where there was some give and take and some tension between him and the administration. Certainly early on. One of the things I found fascinating was I don't know if it was Greyhound or Trailways or whatever, but he made
Right.
an arrangement to make a kneeling bus so that he could help transport the wheelchair students around the campus. So it was fascinating. He maybe crossed the line on some things that today would be, let's just say, politically incorrect. But it was a different time then, and he was determined. I guess his call words were, independent living. Um, and that was at the core of his precept, that we will, as we will get these students to live independently. And, it's interesting because they talk about a coaching tree, that so-and-so's assistant coaches went on. The students that came out of that disability studies program, however you want to call it, at U of I mean, not just athletes, of course. I mean, just an amazing array of people who became leaders in disability, in issues and rights. And a lot of that credit goes to Dr. Nugent, for sure.
And imagine, if you will, whether or not those same students who were going through what they coined Hell Week would have thought that they'd be looking back and giving all of this credit when he was forcing independence on them. People who were, maybe a little more typically coddled by their parents and getting all the help that they need. He was putting a shock in their system in order to get them to believe, as much as he was trying to get the administrators to believe, that they could be independent. So I don't know where he turned for the love and support. If he was pushing the university, he was pushing the students who were the beneficiaries. He was pushing every which way, but clearly it worked, because, to your point, the greatest success from the University of Illinois Division of Rehabilitation Education Services, you can tell I'm alumni, it's not just the fact that they won championships and started the association. It's the fact that lawyers, accountants, doctors, and many other things in between were produced under his watch.
Yeah, his influence goes well beyond the basketball court. Let's just put it that way. And they're I mean, again, he was a very forceful personality, and I think, as Dr. Goodman was in England, I think you needed that back then, because you were breaking down stereotypes. You were doing unprecedented events and uh, education. This hadn't been done before, so you had to be assertive, maybe acerbic too, and you had to be demanding, and you had to say, this is the right way, the wrong way, and this is my way, and or the highway. And he laid down the law. And uh, again, from our perspective, it's maybe a little bit different. Today it would be handled very differently, but when you're out there by yourself, and I will say, with the University of Illinois, it took them a while to sort of recognize what he was doing. And again, his efforts, once they started to get sort of national press and national recognition, not just for the wheelchair basketball team, but for the program, because so many important people passed through there. That's when the administrators went, you know what, we've got somebody here that we really think is a credit to this university.
Yeah,
So,
when similar to when Pan Am could put their branding and logos on the back of every wheelchair and take credit for what they were doing. Similarly, the university got a lot of the halo effect of the accessibility and disability rights work that Dr. Nugent was doing.
right.
What struck me?
Just to add one thing on the university, sorry, because I didn't cover this a lot in the book because, I had to do a lot of other things in the book, but, there would be, let's say, Christmas break. Dr. Nugent would, pile his team into cars and buses and caravan and barnstorm the Midwest, not just to play other teams, but they would give exhibitions to, towns and cities, whether it was wheelchair basketball, wheelchair square dancing, whatever it was. And I mean, you think about it and it's like, well, that's a little corny, but no, what he's bringing, uh, paraplegia and wheelchair, assist, basketball, whatever, out to the mainstream. And not a whole lot of people were doing that back then.
No, agreed. I think it was a format that was happening within the VA and some of those teams with the barnstorming tours, and he was replicating that in the Midwest. What's really interesting to me is I think about his personality and almost like doing what he needed to do and ask for forgiveness maybe later, was how he was able to collaborate with the VA. So here you had this blossoming VA sort of network of teams, and how you had him now at a university coming in and trying to establish the standards of the game, building off of Ray Neerson's work and some others, but how he must have been able to change his style, because if he would have taken the same bull in the China shop philosophy to the VA, they could have simply just rejected him. But instead, he must have been able to flex some different muscles in order to get them to buy it.
Yeah, I think he was very savvy in the sense of when he set up the National Wheelchair Basketball Association. Um, the he's overseeing it as sort of commissioner, so to speak, whether it was that title or not. But he made sure that the key personnel, as president and secretary, were all the athletes. And of course, in those early years, many of them were still veterans. So, and when I say savvy, I'm not saying that like he was being manipulative. I'm saying like, no, you've got to let the members run this. This is a different, set of, and look, he's able-bodied. He's not in the wheelchair, though I'm sure he experimented with that. Um, he wasn't the person to lay down the law about rules and so forth. And I think he was very smart to open that door and be accommodating, so to speak, with the veterans community, because otherwise, you're right, it would not have gone over very well.
I think savvy is a perfect word. It was almost, when you look back on it now, it's interesting. 71 years later, if you say technically, I think in 49 was when the Articles of Incorporation were formed and whatnot. But 71 years later, through all the ups and downs, for the organization to still be providing access to sport for people with disabilities in order to improve quality of life, without putting the self-governance and self-ownership model in place, would it have sustained and weathered all of the storms that the organization's clearly been through? I think whether you want to call it prophetic or not, that might be a little dramatic, but the truth is, self-governance and giving those with disabilities who are beneficiaries of the sport an opportunity to own the work and own the future, I think is one of the smartest things that he did, because we're only a couple years younger than the NBA, so we're doing pretty well ourselves.
Right. No, absolutely. And he among many others, I wish, of course, were still alive for me to have interviewed. Though many others, including our friend Armand Thibodeau and Stan Labanowitz and others, interviewed him at length. And there's quite just a huge volume of his interviews and talks, which is great. Um, but I agree. I mean, he and that alliance that he made with the military in terms of the transport. I mean, I seem to remember him going, like, we were in big trouble money wise, financially. It was pretty hand to mouth, so to speak. And if they hadn't been able to form that alliance, which also included having many of those tournaments at military bases, uh, whether it was Illinois, Midwest, or elsewhere. I think they did a couple in California as well. They might not have survived having an annual tournament. They might have had to take a couple of years off. So,
Agreed.
yeah,
And what's really stands out to me as sort of a hallmark that shows it wasn't a career, it was a purpose of his. From 49 through 2015, 66 years, he did not miss one national wheelchair basketball
yeah.
tournament. And sadly, on Veterans Day in 2015 is when he passed. But how interesting that his passing would take place on Veterans Day as well. But another lifelong contributor, someone whose life's work went into the game of wheelchair basketball, was Dr. Ludwig Goodman, eventually Sir Ludwig Goodman, and what he was doing at Stoke Mandeville games, and what would end up being a precursor to the Paralympics. Maybe you can share a bit about what you learned about Mr. Goodman, and help educate the audience on what they can learn about in the book.
Sure. Again, just a fascinating individual, and an unlikely candidate. I mean, Tim Nugent was someone who really believed in physical fitness and exercise. He was a convert from when he was a young man and had experienced some health issues and so forth. And he was a big believer in sports and was an athlete himself. Ludwig Goodman, not so much himself, but his story is fascinating. He was a German Jewish neurosurgeon. He had to flee the Nazis, flee his homeland in the late 30s, and he ended up in England as opposed to coming to America like so many German Jewish doctors did at the time. And eventually he was put in charge of the spinal cord injury unit at Stoke Mandeville, which is outside of London. And Goodman, again, super controlling, very much, my way or the highway, but also adapted many of the precepts that we were using here in terms of rehabilitation, including sports. And again, I think we mentioned he did archery and netball, which is a very different but similar in some ways game of basketball. There's just no backboard. And certainly in the early years, they had lowered the net. It was not 10 feet. I mean, and you can tell from the photos. Um, but I think what was so important about, or what made him so savvy, he tied from almost day one. He tied this idea of para sports, Paralympics, and it's clear from the literature that we looked at that the origin of Paralympics comes from, paraplegia or paralyzed. That's the para. Um, he tied his games, with the Stoke Mandeville games, with the Olympics from day one. The first tournament, which was an archery tournament that he had, was on the exact day of the opening ceremony of the 1948 London Olympics. And I'm telling, that was not a coincidence. And all through the 50s, he would invite sports celebrities like Roger Bannister, members of the Olympic Committee, to witness and observe the uh, Stoke Mandeville games. And his speeches and his writings, it was, this will be, these games of the handicapped, and that was sort of the term he would use. They will one day be seen as equal to the Olympic Games. And I mean, people were sort of, rolling their eyes like, who is this guy? There's only, 100 people here. But you know what? He knew, right? He knew. And once the Americans started coming over to Stoke Mandeville, which starts in 1955 with the Pan Am Jets, who basically started as wheelchair basketball, but when they came over, they competed in some of the other events that were happening, like archery, and I think they had table tennis there as well.
And just to jump in there, that's actually strategically how Lipton, who was with Bulova, who also was part of the NWAA, which is National Wheelchair Athletic Association, when based on budget and the way that they had to construct the process, they had to pick a group of individuals who weren't necessarily just the optimal basketball team, had to pick individuals who could also deliver, whether it's table tennis, archery, or other sports as well.
Yes, absolutely. And Benjamin Lipton, as you say, with Bulova, and he creates that Bulova Watchmakers team, which is a significant player in all of this. And Lipton's the one who creates track and field events as we know it for wheelchair sports. So he's also another huge contributor, also to basketball, but all sports in general. But it is the Pan Am Jets who go over there first in 1955, and I think Goodman realizes that now that you have the Americans there, both for the prestige and for the media and for the athletics. First of all, he changes course that basketball will be the sport, not netball, and that's very soon, quickly. He also institutes classification at the games because of the different types of disability, whether it's post-polio or someone who was a veteran, let's say. And by 1960, he's really ready to sort of take it to the next level. And that's when you have what is now considered the first modern Paralympics. He arranges to have the Stoke Mandeville games sort of transferred to Rome, 1960, right after the Rome Olympics of 1960, which are famous for Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, and Rayford Johnson, and Wilma Rudolph, and this rivalry between the USA and USSR. And so you have the first Paralympics in 1960, and then also 1964 in Tokyo, following the Tokyo Games. The Tokyo.
And what jumped out to me about the Tokyo was just the geopolitical relations and the history, Pearl Harbor, and everything that happened in World War II, and then having some of the veterans who were still a part of the team, aside from Marv Lapicola, who was the super sub from University of Illinois. You had some of the veterans who were still a part of the team from the early days in the sport, and going into Japan at those Paralympics. Just a really interesting and fascinating subplot, if you will, relative to the story.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was sort of, I mean, I go beyond 64, but not as much, because that's basically, I'm starting to sort of end the narrative in the book at 64 Olympics. The other reason is that's really when the United States gets into Vietnam in a more heavy basis. And so that to me was sort of a natural ending. And of course, we wanted the book to come out for the 2020 Tokyo Paralympics. And of course, that was canceled. So that was the thinking there. But I agree. And when you study the Tokyo Olympics before the Paralympics, I mean, for Japan, this was their coming out party after the war. And they wanted to show the world, but also probably America as well, the television audience, etc., that Japan is a modern nation, that Japan has moved on from the humiliating defeat of World War II, and they are willing to, they are part of this new age of the world. And they showed off their bullet train and, beautiful art and posters and architecture of the stadiums, computers, all of that sort of thing, to show this new face of Japan. And frankly, it was a very important milestone and remains a very important milestone. And the fact that they embraced the Paralympics was also important. And Marv Lapicola, who you mentioned, who was there, and Marv was great. As I would call him up, and we'd just start talking, or he would start talking, and I would listen. But that was a pleasure, believe me. But he would tell me, hey, the crown prince and the crown princess came there and shook hands and attended games and the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony. And that was a huge landmark, both for the Paralympic Games in general, but also for Japan itself as a nation, in terms of healing and moving on and embracing, to some degree, what had happened in the past and being able to move on. So it was a super important moment, both in Olympic, Paralympic history, and we started this about Luke Goodman, and he was the brains behind this, both in 1960 and 64. And finally, I think it was 88 at Seoul, you have finally sort of, that's when everything sort of comes back together with the Olympics and Paralympics starting to be, tied together for, forever, for bid committees, etc.
And it's really interesting. Progress doesn't happen linearly, right? There's fits and starts and whatnot. And as integrated and embraced as the Paralympics were in Tokyo, there were some fits and starts that had occurred after that. And those fits and starts have probably gone all the way to current day. You have some athletes who would probably argue we're not where we need to be, and other athletes who are really satisfied with the progress that has been made because they understand what it was like to be a Paralympian, in the 80s, let's say. But
Right.
what's really interesting to me is just thinking about your mindset as you're pouring yourself into the final stages of your book. A lot of things changing even here in the States, which we would say we're pretty advanced as it relates to the Paralympic movement and adaptive sport and disability rights and whatnot. But the USOC goes from the USOC to the USOPC to formally include Paralympics in that name. We've had other changes that have occurred where now Paralympians get the same financial reward for their medals as the Olympic counterparts and whatnot. So even as recent as the last 18 months, significant strides. So it's going to be really interesting. What does progress look like for the next 20 years as well?
Yeah, totally interesting. And, there easily probably could be another book from sort of, from moving on from 64 to where we are today. I mean, for me, again, somebody sort of tiptoeing into that story. And Marv Lapicola talked a lot about this, and so did others. The community, Paralympians, etc., who sort of took control in a sense of the sport and their fate. And by that I mean, for instance, equipment. The medical model of, oh, here's your E&J wheelchair, good luck. Well, as everybody knows, that's medieval technology, so to speak.
It's interesting to that point. In your book, you talk about Bud Rumpel and the work that he was doing on the equipment, which may have been late 60s, early 70s, if memory serves me correctly. And he was part of the Westland Sparks, or the Detroit Sparks, home of many Hall of Famers who competed there. But then you have someone like Dave Kiley, who's a living legend in the sport, who was sponsored by Sunrise and Quickie. And the next sort of evolution of that was putting anti-tip bars on the back of sports chairs in the mid to late 90s, which really, along with strapping, allowed us to kind of fully optimize the level of function that we retained as athletes. So it's just really fascinating to think, what are those moments in time where innovation impacted the athleticism that was put on display? And to your point, what was the source of that innovation? Were you waiting on some third-party medical provider to come up with the innovation, or are you going direct to the user? And logically, it's going to be the user who understands how to optimize a little bit more.
Right. And I mean, you know, we're sort of joking around about Everest and Jennings. I mean, but if you go back to the roots of that, Everest himself was a paraplegic, and he had been in a mining accident, and he was discouraged, depressed, because he couldn't go out and get a job because the wheelchairs were so bulky. He enlisted Jennings, another engineer, and I mean, literally, like in a garage in Santa Monica, they put together that first, what I guess we would call a modern wheelchair, you know, that was collapsible and weighed, you know, 45 pounds, which at that time was, or 50 pounds, state of the art. You know, Gene Fessenmeyer called it a Cadillac back then, you know, but you know, that, you know, here that huge leap in wheelchairs that, again, we sort of look at today and go, what? And think about it, when the Americans, when the Pan Am jets went to England for the first time in 1955 with their wheelchairs, and everybody from the European teams were in those, you know, lazy boy chairs on wheels. I mean, it was unbelievable. They just, you know, wheeled circles around these guys.
Cruel and unusual punishment for them to be in one sort of outdated chair, but you know, that's part of the learning process. I think E&J, the work that Rumpel was doing to fine tune them, then what was happening in the 90s, and again, my mind can't help but go to like, what's next to truly put on display the athleticism of these athletes, because I'm sure points per game and score and, you know, pace and all of that, you know, completely changed, you know, when these introductions happened. I wanted to touch on another item with you. I have no idea how we're doing for time because I'm just completely enthralled by the conversation. But one of the pieces that you talked about in the book was the impact that this population also had on disability rights. And one of the pieces that stood out to me was when these barnstorming tours would take place, where I believe it was the Flying Wheels, but you can correct me, maybe it was the Devils, who would go on the tours, and they would hit multiple cities across the US, but they would always stop in DC, and they would either get to the Senate or get to the White House and go and advocate first and foremost on behalf of veterans with disabilities, but that had an impact on disability rights in general. So talk a bit about that influence and the impact that it had societally.
Yeah, and you know, I couldn't have done this book without the contributions of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, which was the group formed by the veterans in these VA hospitals in 46, 47, 48 into this national organization. And you know, we talk about those early basketball and even the NWBT, you know, the money raised from them, you know, ticket sales and maybe some advertising in a program would go to oftentimes the PVA, and it was to help with paraplegia research. It was, you know, to help for lobbying, all sorts of things, and to put out their magazine and newsletter, which sort of kept everybody in touch. And at first, yes, it was exclusively veterans and only about veterans' rights, but what the Flying Wheels did was sort of start that in motion in terms of lobbying for disability rights and all of the PVA. And as you mentioned, the Flying Wheels, that became an annual barnstorming. I think it went from 48 to 59 or 60, and they had everywhere they went, there were newspaper articles and people wrote about them. They were in the newsreels back in the day. And yeah, I think when they would play, certainly in the early days, they would play the Richmond VA hospital team, and maybe it was the Charioteers or what they call them.
Yeah.
They would always stop in DC and lobby, and that was how that accessible homes, the stipend for those accessible homes, that's sort of how that came about, and that was groundbreaking. I mean, imagine that. I mean, today the Congress saying, okay, we're going to give you $100,000 towards a building and designing an accessible home. Well, that's a game changer, right? So it was the equivalent of that, and actually sort of interesting, who supported it and who didn't. But they made the point: we are veterans. Not We're paralyzed veterans. We're not asking for pity. We're not asking for anything special. We're asking for help to be able to accommodate living a quote unquote normal life. What does that entail? Well, we need special cars, and it's not that big a deal. And we need homes that are built a little bit differently, because we have some slightly different needs. Other than that, we're good. So I really feel that was a huge element. And I bring this point up before. When you think about it, when the war started, our president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As everybody knows, he was in a wheelchair because of polio. Yet he never allowed himself, or very rarely, and it was usually by a friend by circumstance, he never allowed himself to be photographed that way. If he had to be in public, he would strap on those crazy, braces, sort of stagger, using his son to hold on to, stagger to the podium, give his speech, come back. But if he's in the Oval Office or at home, he's using his wheelchair to get around. But that was the stigma. I mean, here you have the president of the United States saying, I'm not going to be photographed in a wheelchair because to his understanding, and probably meant most people at that time, that was a weakness. That was a vulnerability that you could not show to the world. Here you have these men coming back from war, and they're in their wheelchair, and they're in Madison Square Garden in front of 15,000 crazy fans, going, "What is this?" And that was 1948. A couple weeks later, Jack Gerhardt is on the cover of Newsweek magazine, in a wheelchair, holding a basketball in his uniform. I mean,
It
what does
becomes
that
becomes a national hero at the same time.
Yeah. And, that leads to a major motion picture called The Men with Marlon Brando, which, frankly, has been forgotten by history. It's not the greatest movie of all time. We know that, but that was certainly an important step in terms of, that wasn't, oh, everything's peachy keen, when you have an injury like this. No, that showed a dark side, as well that could be done back in those days. So these men realized that I guess, in a sense, they had an obligation to show the world, here we are. We're not going away. And it's important for you to look at us and realize that, we have as the slogan went for the PBA, it's ability, not disability that counts. And it's a huge step, huge milestone.
And I think became a bit of a template for other people with disabilities who would eventually go on and learn to self-advocate and go and work hard for their brothers and sisters with disabilities as well. So many disability rights advocates not involved in sport at all who then would go on and push. And we just celebrated the 30-year anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but all of the work that we're talking about relative to the lobbying and things of the like created the precursor for that. The work that Nugent did as well created a lot of the standards that would go into that. And I just think about where would we be on Veterans Day in 2020 without the extensive work of the greatest generation of people who came back and taught us that despite the difficulties that they faced, they still had an obligation to go out and doggedly pursue equality. And I'm really grateful on this Veterans Day that they did that. I'm grateful for Dr. Nugent and for what he did to instill the confidence in many, along with Dr. Goodman, to do the same. And David, I couldn't close this without saying I'm incredibly grateful for you and the work that you did to shine a light on so many incredible stories, but also to show the arc of the sport and the disability rights movement. I think you've done it incredibly. And for anyone watching this video, the name of the book is Wheels of Courage by David Davis, and we're really grateful for your contribution.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you, Will. And what can I say? It was an honor and a pleasure to go into this story.